Hello everyone, welcome to Asera Psych, and today I want to talk about introverted sensing. And this video is going to be just as much for me as it is for you, because in my opinion, introverted sensing is the hardest cognitive function to understand from a cognitive perceptual standpoint. Jung wrote about it in Psychological Types, but it's a very difficult chapter to really understand and interpret. So I've been doing a lot of research into that chapter, and I kind of want to talk about what I've found and how I interpret introverted sensing as a function. Let's get into it. So, introverted intuition and introverted sensing are very similar functions in that they're both irrational subjective functions. They are both introverted perceiving functions. The primary difference between these two functions, though, is that introverted intuition involves the subjective interpretation of an object via possibilities and ideas, where introverted sensing involves the subjective perception of an object via sensory impression. The important words to take away here are subjective interpretation and perception, because introverted sensing and introverted intuition don't experience the world directly for what it is. They filter the world through their subjective lens, their subjective perception lens, which causes them to experience the world in a shifted way compared to what actually is. And this causes them to have their own direct subjective interpretation of the entire world, or the world of ideas in the case of the intuitive. This is particularly interesting in the case of the introverted sensing type, because the introverted sensing type is one that you would expect to interact with the actual physical world as a sensing type. But this is actually not the case. The introverted sensing type doesn't experience the world directly through sensation. They instead have their own subjective interpretation of the sensory world. In Psychological Types, Jung describes this by suggesting that if you put a few introverted sensing types in front of a landscape and ask them all to paint that landscape, then the psychic attitude and the mood of each of their paintings would be different, because each introverted sensing type is experiencing their own subjective interpretation of the thing that it is that they're viewing. When they view the landscape, it is not objective to them. They are subjectively interpreting that landscape and applying it to their art or whatever it is that they're producing. This is primarily how the introverted sensing type interacts with the world. They don't interact with the direct sensory object itself, but instead through their subjective interpretation of whatever it is that they're sensing, what the object inspires within them. And that's the primary difference between an introverted sensing type and an extroverted sensing type. Let's say you had an extroverted sensing type and you asked them to interact with an object. They would place value in the object itself, what they are directly experiencing from the object. That is to say, its shape, its form, its use, things of that nature. Where the introverted sensing type would instead place their value in whatever the object inspires from within them, whatever the object means to them on a subjective interpretation level. When referring to introverted sensing types in Psychological Types, Carl Jung writes, "Actually, he lives in a mythological world where men, animals, locomotives, houses, rivers, and mountains appear as either benevolent deities or malevolent demons. That they appear thus to him never enters his head, though that is just the effect they have on his judgments and actions." What this essentially means is that the introverted sensing type doesn't experience the object directly for what it is, but instead through their internal perception of it as almost an archetype, which is to say that if the object inspires benevolence or malevolence from them, they're going to view it differently based on what they're perceiving from it. It doesn't matter what the object is in and of itself, but the subjective interpretation of that object is what inspires value from the introverted sensing type. This is often the reason you'll find that introverted sensing types are the ones who collect memorabilia or other things that are important to them from their past, because these things allow them to re-experience a subjective interpretation that they had at one time. When they collect things that are important to them from their past, they're allowed to re-experience that first impression that they received from that thing. And it's unlikely that that first impression is going to change unless some sort of new event becomes attached to it. This is often why you'll find that introverted sensing types have photographs of their family or things of that nature in their house more than extroverted sensing types, because they're the types who can view such photos and be brought back to some experience that they had. They can re-experience that subjective interpretation. To give kind of a brief example of this, I have an older sister who's an ENFP, and 2 years ago, my grandfather who lived with her passed away. And when he passed away, my sister reached out to me and she asked me if I would like to have any of the things from his career as a firefighter. She had his old jacket and his old helmet, things of that nature. And to me, that was a strange question because I'm not the one who can collect things and have some sort of positive association to them. I don't collect things from my past to bring forth some sort of subjective sensory impression from them. But she, as an ENFP, even though introverted sensing is still repressed, has value attached to the sensory impression of things. So I'm not the kind of person who has things scattered around my house that are going to remind me of some sort of sensory impression that I've had in the past, but introverted sensing types are going to be more likely to do that. And the really interesting thing about this is that this is how introverted sensing types are constantly experiencing the world of sensation. They're applying that subjective sensory interpretation to the world. And this is why you'll often find that they want to keep their environment somewhat stable and full of things that they know are going to bring sensory interpretations in a good way to them. They're not going to want to fill their house with things that are associated with bad sensory memories. They want to fill their houses with pictures of family members, things of that nature, things that they have collected from their lives that have sentimental meaning to them on the sensory level. My father is an ESFJ, and if you walk into his house, it is covered wall to wall with photos of his family, of his grandparents, of his various children. And all of that is something that I can't relate to as an introverted, intuitive, extroverted sensing type. I don't hold association with things like that in the same way that an introverted sensing type would. All of this is really interesting, in my opinion, when you look at the introverted sensing dominant type, because introverted sensing dominant types aren't that different from introverted intuitive dominant types, in that they're both introverted perceiving types that are irrational and subjective. And what that means is that for them to really express their internal perceptions, they have to do it through the translation of their extroverted rational function, which is either thinking or feeling. So when an introverted sensing type attempts to explain what it is that they're perceiving internally, they have to rationalize it. And in that rationalization process, some of its original meaning is lost. Some of the original interpretation is lost and only partially expressed. This is why Carl Jung thought that artistic expression in any form was great for introverted perceiving dominant types, SI and NI. Because when you convert something into words, you have to kind of make it rational through that thinking and feeling function. But if you convert something into art, into some sort of artistic expression, then it doesn't have to directly be rational. It can be a better reflection of the introverted perception that the SI or NI dominant type has. So, to summarize, introverted sensing is a cognitive function that allows one to have a subjective interpretation of a sensory experience, to which then an archetype or a value is applied to on some unconscious level. And in my opinion, introverted sensing types, ISTJs and ISFJs, don't get nearly enough credit in the personality typology and MBTI community, because at its core, introverted sensing is going to be one of the most creative functions. All of the positive attributes that you would apply to introverted intuition can also be realistically applied to introverted sensing as well, because that highly subjective nature, that unique view on things of the world, is still there within the introverted sensing type, just like you're likely to find in the introverted intuitive type as well. The subjective interpretation is one of the largest factors of the introverted perceiving dominant types, both intuition and sensing. Alright everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on introverted sensing. In my opinion, introverted sensing is one of the more interesting cognitive functions because of its difficulty to understand from a conceptual and cognitive standpoint. But I hope that this discussion and video has helped you understand introverted sensing a little bit better. I would like to remind everybody that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asurapsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura at Asura Psych. Have a good one.